The letter came back to me, with the name washed off the top. Rain had taken it, the salutation, the hold it was bound for, the lady's name I had set down in my own hand and sealed under my own ring. Every word beneath it had survived. And on the reverse, in a small, square, unhurried hand I had never seen in my life, somebody had written me an answer. I read it standing in the muniment room at Hikaro with my cloak still dripping onto the flagstones, and I did not sit down until I had read it 3 times. "Sir, whoever you are," it said, "your letter crossed the skein in the wrong weather and the head of it is gone. I have no notion who you meant it for and no way of finding out, since the Tower ledger went into the gorge the same night. But the rest of it is too good a thing to burn, and a man who writes like that ought not to be left standing at a dark window waiting on nothing. So, yes, the winter here is long. No, I do not mind it. And no, I do not think a man is a fool for saying out loud that he is lonely. Half the Reach is lonely. You are only the first one honest enough to put it on paper and pay a courier to carry it. And under that, instead of a name, the keeper of the 7th tower. I want it understood before anything else that I knew exactly what I was holding. I knew the letter had gone astray. I knew the honorable thing was to send a writer back down the ladder that same hour with a correction and an apology and a second copy properly addressed. I was Alpha King of the Thurn Reach. I had ended 2 border feuds and rebuilt half a road system, and I was not, by any account, a man who let errors stand. I put the letter in the breast of my coat, and I did not send the writer. That is where this begins, and I have never once been able to make myself sorry for it. You will want to know what the letter said, the one that got ruined. I will tell you because it matters later, and because I have no pride left to protect on the subject. My counsel had been at me for 2 winters about a mate. Not gently. The Thurn Reach is a hard country to govern, a gorge kingdom, all terraces and rope bridges and villages stacked up the sides of cliffs like books on a shelf, and a hard country wants to know that its king is not the last of anything. I had no brothers. I had a cousin in the south I would not have trusted with a dog. So they brought me names and portraits and the daughters of allied holds, and every one of them was walked into my hall like a horse at a fair, and every one of them I sent home the same day, courteous and unmarried. It was not coldness. I want that plain too. It was that my wolf had never once risen for any of them. Some men's wolves are near the surface. You can see the beast looking out of the eyes of half my riders. Mine had been silent since my father died. Not gone. I could feel him the way you feel a room behind a shut door. But he did not come. Not for war, not for grief, not for a single woman my counsel paraded past me. My mother had told me once that the beast waits for the one thing it wants and sleeps through everything else. And I had decided, somewhere around my 28th year, that mine had simply decided to sleep through my whole life. So when my steward, Sten Voyle, put the Marrow proposal in front of me for the 4th time, I did not say no. I said I would write. Not a proclamation, not a contract in 3 copies with a seal clerk breathing over it. I told Sten I would write to the Lady Ilsabet Marrow the way one person writes to another, and if she answered in kind then we would speak, and if she did not then he was to never raise the matter with me again. He thought it was a trick to get out of it. It was not. I sat down that night in the muniment room with a plain sheet and no clerk, and I wrote the truest letter of my life to a woman I had never met, because I could not think of any other way to find out whether there was a person at the other end of all those portraits. I told her I did not know how to do this. I told her that I ate my supper alone at a table built for 30, and that the sound of my own knife on the plate had begun to bother me. I told her I had not wanted a mate for the sake of an heir and would not pretend otherwise, that if she came to Hikaro expecting a crown and a cold husband she would get both and be miserable, and that I would rather have one honest refusal than a polite yes. I told her about the window at the top of the west stair where you can see the whole ladder lit at night, all 7 towers, and how I stood there more than I should. I sealed it. I sent it down the ladder. And 10 days later it came back to me shipwrecked, with a stranger's handwriting on the back of it telling me I was not a fool. You have to understand what the ladder is, or none of this will make sense. The Thurn Reach cannot be crossed quickly. A rider going from Hikaro to Marrow Hold by road goes down one gorge wall and up another and around the head of Threadwater, and if the weather is generous, it takes him 6 days. So a long time ago somebody built towers instead. 7 of them on the 7 highest shoulders of the reach, each in sight of the next, each with a great bell and a keeper and a pair of runners called the Quick. A message goes up the first tower, the bell rings the pattern, the next tower answers, and a rider runs the short leg between. What takes a courier 6 days takes the ladder a day and a half. It is the fastest thing in the kingdom. In my grandfather's time, men used to say the ladder outran bad news, which is the closest thing to poetry my country has ever produced. And there is an old law about it that nobody in my council would admit to believing and nobody in my hills would sleep easy breaking. They call it the mate bell. The belief is this: a message sent toward a false match will not hold. The seal breaks, the rider falls, the bell rings, the rain gets in. Send a proposal down the ladder to the wrong woman and the reach itself will spoil the paper. My grandmother believed it absolutely. My council would have laughed at it in daylight. Every one of my keepers, when they hand over a betrothal letter, still touches 2 fingers to the bell rope first. I did not believe it either. I wrote back to the keeper of the 7th tower that same night, and I did not sign my name. That was cowardice, and I have called it cowardice ever since. But I will tell you what I told myself at the time, which was this: whoever she was, she had written to a stranger she thought was some lonely scholar or some widowed captain, and she had written to him as an equal. She had teased me. Nobody had teased me since I was 19 years old. If I signed Corin Vale, Alpha King of the Thurn Reach at the bottom of my page, that would end the moment it began. She would go careful and formal and frightened, the way everyone in my country goes when my name enters a room, and I would have exchanged something real for something correct. So I wrote, "You are right that half the reach is lonely, and wrong that I paid a courier." The letter went by the ladder, which, as you know, does not take coin from anyone. I told her I would not ask her name if she would not ask mine. I told her the letter had been meant for a woman I had never met, that it had cost me 3 nights to write, and that having it answered by somebody who did not have to answer it at all was the single kindest thing that had happened to me in a year. And I asked her what had happened on the bridge. Her second letter took 11 days because the skein was still out, and it came the long way round with a wool train. It ran to 4 pages. I have it still. The storm had come up the gorge from the west and taken the middle span of the Skane Bridge at about the 9th hour. The 7th tower, hers, sits on the far shoulder above Brackenwind, and it is the only tower on that side of the water. With the bridge gone, the ladder ended at 6. There were 11 messages in the 7th tower's basket that night, mine among them, and no way to move any of them. So she had gone down the gorge in the dark, roped, and crossed at the old ford, and climbed the other side, and put the whole basket into the hands of the 6th tower's keeper at some hour before dawn, and climbed back. She wrote about it the way you would write about mending a fence. What went wrong, she said, was that she had carried the basket against her chest under her coat, and her coat had not been as good as she thought, and by the time she got down to the water everything on top was wet through. Mine had been on top. The ink of the salutation had gone into the ink of the second line, and both had come out gray. I read the rest of it in the tower with the door shut, she wrote, and I want you to know I did not enjoy myself, reading a thing that was not for me. But I could not find out who it was for, and I could not send it on to nobody. I sat with it 2 days. Then I thought, somewhere there is a man waiting at a window for an answer he is never going to get, and he will decide the silence means something it does not mean, and I could not have that on me. She signed it again, the keeper of the 7th tower. I did not eat that evening. Sten Voyle asked me twice whether I was ill. I told myself for perhaps a month that I was being courteous, that she had done me a service and it would be ill-bred to break off, that there was no harm in it. Then the letters got past the point where I could tell myself anything at all. We wrote about small things mostly. That is what I did not expect. Her father had been keeper at the 7th before her 16 years, and his hands had gone bad from 3 winters of frost until he could not grip the rope, and his sight was going at the edges. So she did the ringing and he did the ledger from memory, and between them the Reach never noticed the tower had changed hands. She was proud of that and did not say so directly. She spliced her own bell rope, because the man they sent from Hikaro spliced it badly, and it slipped in wet weather. She kept a goat that she disliked intensely and could not bring herself to be rid of. There was a chestnut wood below the tower that dropped its nuts onto the roof through October so that the whole month sounded, she said, like somebody dealing cards very slowly on the other side of the wall. And she asked me things nobody asks a king, whether I liked my work, whether I had ever wanted to be anything else, what I did when I could not sleep, whether I had people or only staff. That one took me 2 days to answer, and when I did I told the truth, which was, staff, good ones, loyal. But I had not said an unguarded thing out loud to another living person in 4 years, and the reason I had not was that every unguarded thing a king says gets carried out of the room and weighed. She wrote back, then say them to me. I am 5 days' ride away, and I have no one to carry them to. That is what I am for. I read that in the muniment room, and I put my hand flat on the table, and the door in the back of me came open. I will not use the phrase everyone uses. My wolf did not do the thing the songs say. What happened was this. I lifted the page closer to read a word she had crossed out, and I smelled her. Not perfume. There was nothing on the paper but paper. It was rain coming down through a wood of chestnut and wet stone, and the particular cold green smell of a place high up where the mist sits. I had never been within 20 miles of the 7th tower in my life. I could not have told you what that shoulder of the Reach smelled like. But my wolf came up out of 11 years of silence to stand at the front of my skull with his hackles flat and his whole attention on a folded sheet of paper, and what he gave me was not a word or a feeling. It was a place. He knew where she was. He knew it the way you know your own doorway in the dark. I sat there until the candle went out. I should have ridden that night. I have gone over it more times than is good for a man. If I had put a horse under me that night and gone down the ladder tower by tower and knocked on her door and told her everything, all of what came after would not have come. Nobody would have stood up in my hall. Nobody would have been shamed in front of 400 people. She would have been spared the worst week of her life. But I did not ride, and here is the reason, and it is a bad one. I was afraid that if I went it would stop. By the turn of the year, I was writing to her twice a week, and lying to my own steward about the ink. Sten Voyle is not a fool. He noticed that a man who had refused to write letters for 2 winters was now waiting in the muniment room on latter days. And because my counsel had precisely one explanation available to them for a king behaving like that, they came to exactly the wrong conclusion, and they came to it happily, and they came to it loudly. Word had gone out with the first letter that I had written to Marrow Hold. That is how a court works. So when the king began haunting the ladder for his post, the whole of Hikaro decided that the Lady Ilsabet Marrow had answered, and that the answer had taken, and that the thing they had wanted for 2 winters was finally happening on its own. And I let them. That is the part that has never sat easy. I did not tell them a lie. I never once said the letters came from Marrow Hold. But I heard Sten say it in front of the council in the 2nd week of February. The correspondence with the lady is proceeding, and I looked at the table and let it stand, because to correct him, I would have had to say out loud what I was actually doing, and I could not think of a single way to say it that did not sound like a man making a fool of himself over a bell-keeper he had never met. So I said nothing, and a court that hears nothing writes it down as yes. In March they fixed the assembly. Sten brought it to me with the air of a man delivering a gift. The Marrow Alliance had been put to the Hold's elders and had been received warmly. Lady Ilsebet's father had answered within the week. The Reach would gather at Hykero at the first full moon after the thaw for a formal betrothal assembly. 400 people, the 7 keepers, the Hold lords, the whole ladder rung to announce it. He put the schedule down in front of me and stood back the way you stand back from something you expect to be admired. I said, she has agreed to this. Her father has agreed to it, Sten said. She has raised no objection. Considering the correspondence, sire, I did not think an objection was likely. Show me her letter. He blinked. Which letter? Any of them, I said. Show me one thing she has written. He went and got the file. It took him some time because there were only 4 things in it, and every one of them was in a clerk's hand and signed by her father's seneschal, and not one of them was a woman writing to a man. I stood in that room and understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what I had done. I had never once, in 6 months, written the name Marrow at the top of a page. I had never once received it at the bottom of one. Every letter I had sent since October had gone by the ladder to the 7th tower, addressed to a keeper, and every letter I had received had come back from the 7th tower signed by a keeper, and my own court, and my own steward, and by now very probably a hold full of Marrows, had been reading the traffic on my own relay as a courtship with a woman who had never put pen to paper in her life. And if I let that stand for one more day, then at the first full moon after the thaw I was going to walk into my own hall in front of 400 people and stand beside a stranger. Sire, Sten said, are you unwell? Cancel nothing, I said. Say nothing to anyone. Have Bryn saddle 2 horses for the morning and tell no one which road. Where are we going? I was already at the door. Down the ladder, I said, every tower. I did not sleep that night. I stood at the top of the west stair where you can see all 7 fires lit along the shoulders of the Reach, one to the next, going away into the dark toward a chestnut wood I had never walked in, and a woman whose name I had never asked for. And I thought about how the old people say a message sent toward the wrong woman will not hold. The rain got in, I thought. The rain got in on purpose. And then, because I am a practical man and always have been, I thought, she is going to hear about the assembly. The ladder carries everything. It would have gone out the same day Sten fixed the date. The king is to be betrothed at the first full moon. Ring it up the line, tell the towers. 7 keepers would ring it. She would ring it herself. She would stand in her own tower with her own hands on the rope she spliced, and ring out the news that the man she had been writing to for 6 months, the man she had told about her father's hands and the goat and the sound of the chestnuts on the roof, was going to be married in front of the whole Reach to somebody else. She did not know it was me. She had no reason on earth to connect the two. But she was going to ring that bell. I went down the stair fast enough that the guard at the bottom put his hand on his sword before he saw who it was, and I was in the yard shouting for Bryn Terrow 4 hours before I had told anyone I would be. And I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted the next 5 days to be shorter than they were. We went out of Hykero at 4 in the morning with the frost still on the yard stones, and Bryn Terrow did not ask me a single question until we were past the 2nd bridge. He had been my father's rider before he was mine. He is a small, weathered, entirely unimpressible man who has carried news of 2 wars and 1 plague up that road, and the only thing I have ever seen rattle him is a horse being handled badly. So when he finally spoke, he did it without looking over. We're going the whole ladder, sire, or as far as it takes. As far as it takes. And what is it we're looking for? I thought about how to answer that. Handwriting, I said. He nodded slowly, as if that were an ordinary thing to ride out for before dawn in March. Then we'll want the tower ledgers, not the keepers, he said. Keepers lie to kings. Ledgers don't know how. The first tower stands on the shoulder above Hikaru itself, close enough that the town wakes to it. The keeper there is a widow named Asa Farron, who has had the post 19 years, and who once fined my father's steward for ringing her bell without leave. And she came out into the cold in her nightgown and a man's coat and did not curtsy, because she was already reaching for the ledger. That is the sort of woman the ladder attracts. I have thought about that a good deal since. October, I said, the night the skein went. She turned the pages with 2 fingers licked from habit. 11 messages held at 7, she read. Bridge down at the 9th hour. Traffic resumed the 14th of October, 4 days late. Her finger stopped. There it is. Your letter, sire. Down the line the 7th of October, taken at 7 the 8th. Taken, I said. Taken, she agreed. Then she frowned and turned the page back. Number beg pardon. Taken at 7 on the 8th, and then 7 rang again on the 12th. Spoiled. The word went through me like cold water. I should explain, because it is the whole hinge of this. When a message goes down the ladder, every tower rings it on, and the last tower, the one that will put it into a rider's hand and send it the final miles on foot, rings back an answer up the line. 2 strokes means taken. It arrived whole, it is being carried, be at peace. 1 stroke means spoiled. The paper is ruined, the seal is broken, the thing did not survive the road. Send it again. 6 months before, at some hour on the 12th of October, standing in a tower on the far side of a broken bridge with my ruined letter in her hands, and no ledger left to tell her whose it was, the keeper of the 7th tower had put her palm on a rope she had spliced herself, and wrung a single stroke out over the gorge. And every tower up the line had heard it and passed it on, and it had come into Hikaru at last, and some clerk had written spoiled in a book, and nobody had ever thought to bring it to me, because kings are not troubled with the weather. 1 stroke, and then, instead of leaving it there, she had sat with it for 2 days and written to me anyway. Sire, Asa Farron said, you've gone a color. How many messages have come up from 7 since October? She counted. She was a long time about it. 51, she said at last, which is a very great deal of traffic for the 7th tower, sire, if you don't mind my saying. Half of them addressed here to the muniment room, no hold, no name. I did wonder. Did you say so to anyone? To the master of the ladder, she said. In November, he told me to mind my rope. I rode on with that sitting in my chest like a stone. The 2nd tower gave us nothing but the same story in a worse hand. The 3rd is at Callow's Edge, where the master of the ladder keeps his office, and Godfrey Sarn came out to meet us in the yard with his coat already buttoned, which told me he had been warned we were coming and had had a night to think. He is a competent man. I want to be fair to him even now. He had run the ladder for 11 years and run it well. The towers were sound and the quick were paid on time, and in his whole tenure we had lost exactly 1 message that mattered, and that was mine. Sire, he said, this is an honor we weren't expecting. The 7th tower, I said. 51 messages up the line since October and 51 down. Who is the keeper? Something moved behind his face. Hugh Osley, sire, 16 years in the post. Hugh Osley is going blind, I said, and cannot close his hand on a rope. Who is the keeper? The yard got very quiet. Bryn was standing at the horses' heads with his eyes on the middle distance, being extremely uninterested in a way I could feel from 10 feet away. His daughter rings it, Sarn said. Marad Osley, it is an irregularity. I have not corrected it because she rings better than her father did, and the tower has never once been late. Marad Osley, I said. It was the first time I had ever said her name, and I had to say it a 2nd time to make it hold still. You have known since when? Since 2 winters ago. And in November, when Asa Farron came to you, and said the king is exchanging letters twice a week with the 7th tower, you knew exactly who was at the other end of them. He did not answer that at all, which was an answer. Master Sarn, I said, show me the running book for November. He had it brought. He did not try to stop me, and I have wondered since whether that was honesty or fatalism. I stood in a cold yard at Callow's Edge and read down a column of ink until I found the 14th of November, and there, logged out of the 7th tower and up the line to Hikaro, was a message I had never received. Every message on that page had a mark beside it, FWD, forwarded on. That one had a different mark, held. "What is this?" I said. "Sire, you held a message to me." "I held a message to the muniment room," Sarn said, "which was where the traffic was going and which is not a person and which had no name on it." He had gone gray, but his voice stayed level, and I will give him that much. "Sire, forgive me. I have run this ladder 11 years and I know what 50 letters look like. When Asa came to me, I read the log and I understood what was happening, or I thought I did, that some clerk of yours in the muniment room had struck up a correspondence with a girl at the far end of my line and was using the king's relay to do it. That is theft. That is what I believed I was looking at. And then in November a letter came up out of 7 asking, in plain words, to be told the name of the man she was writing to or to be let alone. He stopped. I read it. I should not have. I did. And you held it. I held it, he said, for a fortnight while I made inquiries, and in the middle of that fortnight the court announced that the king was courting Marrow, and I understood that I had been wrong about who was writing, and that I was holding a letter asking a king for his name. His hands had begun to shake. Sire, there was no version of that fortnight that ended well for me. I burned it. And then I told myself it was a mercy, because the Lady Marrow was as good as settled, and no good could come to a bell-keeper's daughter from an answer. I stood there in the cold and thought about a woman standing in a tower for a fortnight, and then a month, and then 5, having asked a stranger for his name and been given silence, and going on writing to him anyway, twice a week, about her father's hands and the goat and the chestnuts on the roof. She had asked. She had asked once, straight out, and never asked again, and never once made me feel it. "You will ride to Hikaro," I said, "and you will present yourself to Sten Voyle, and you will write down everything you have just told me, and you will sign it. You will not soften a line of it. And at the assembly, you will stand up in front of 400 people, and say it out loud." He went so pale I thought he might sit down in the mud. "Sire, it will finish me." "You held a letter that asked for a name," I said, "because you decided she was not worth an answer. Master Sarn, I did the same thing for 6 months and had less excuse. Go and write it down." We were 4 days getting to the skein, and every mile of it I learned more about her from people who had no idea they were telling a king anything. At a wool station under Threadwater, a carter told us about the night the bridge went, because it is the best story that country has. How the Osley girl went down the gorge on a rope in the dark with the whole basket strapped to her, and crossed at the old ford where the water was up past a horse's chest, and climbed the far side, and knocked up the 6th tower's keeper before dawn, and then went home. He told it with enormous relish. He also told us she had done it because there had been a physician's letter in that basket bound for a farm at Amberhow where a child was ill, and she had not known which of the 11 it was, so she had carried all of them. I had known about the letters getting wet. She had never mentioned the child. At Amberhow itself, an old woman selling cheese told me, unprompted, that the tower girl had a goat with a foul temper that she had been meaning to sell for 3 years and would never sell, and that she read out loud to her father in the evenings because his eyes had gone, and that she was too plain-spoken to have got herself a husband and too useful to be spared one, which the old woman clearly considered a great local tragedy. On the 5th morning I sent Bryn away from me, which he did not like. "Marrow, hold," I said. "Give this into the Lady Ilsabet's own hand, nobody else's, and wait for her answer." He looked at the seal and then at me. "And what's in it?" "An apology," I said, "and a question. Whether she has ever written a word to me in her life, and whether she will come to Hikaro and say so out loud in front of her father and mine council, and the whole reach." That's a hard thing to ask a woman. It is the only honest thing left in the whole business, I said. Go. I went down to the skein alone. They had rebuilt the middle span over the winter, and it was raining. Of course it was raining. A fine gray rain coming up the gorge with the smell of the water in it. I crossed on foot leading the horse because I did not trust new rope in wet weather, and I went up the far shoulder by the track through Brackenwind, and about 2/3 of the way up the road turns into a chestnut wood. I stopped in the middle of it. 11 years. 11 years of a shut door, and my father dead behind it, and every woman my counsel walked past me met with nothing at all. I had made a settled peace with the idea that whatever in me was supposed to know its own had simply not survived him. And in a wet wood on the wrong side of a gorge, with the rain coming down through the bare branches, and the whole hillside smelling of cold stone and green, and the last year's leaves going soft underfoot, he came up in me like a man standing out of a chair. Here was all of it, not a word. A certainty dropped whole into the middle of me. Here, this is the place, she is at the top of this hill. I stood in the rain with my hand on the horse's neck and my eyes shut, and I was, for about a minute, not a king at all, only a man of 34 who had smelled that wood off a sheet of paper in October, and had spent 5 months telling himself it was a trick of the mind. Then I got hold of myself and went up the hill, and I wanted understood that I went up it having already decided one thing absolutely, that I would not test her. I had thought about it. God help me. On the second night of that ride I had lain awake and considered arriving as a courier, a clerk from the muniment room, and finding out first whether she would be as she was on paper. It is the sort of thing kings do in stories, and I have never once heard of it ending in anything but a woman with excellent reason to be furious. She had asked a man his name in November and been answered with silence. She was not going to be tried on top of that, and pass, and be told afterwards that she had been sitting an examination. So I came up out of the trees to the 7th tower with my own face on, in the rain, and she was on the roof. It is a squat stone tower with an open bell stage at the top and an outside stair, and she was on the stair with her sleeves pushed up and her arms full of wet rope, doing something to the splice with a marlinspike held in her teeth. She had a gray shawl over her head that had given up being any use an hour ago. She looked down at me the way you look at a stranger who has come a long way up a hill for no obvious reason, took the spike out of her mouth and said, "If that horse goes on the terrace, I'll want a word with you about my leeks." "He'll stand," I said. "They all stand until they don't." She came down 3 steps and stopped. I watched her take in the horse first, then the cloak, then the ring, and I watched her face do something very quiet and very fast, like a light being turned down. She came the rest of the way down and put her hands behind her back and said, in a completely different voice, "Sire." "Married Osley." "Yes." "My name is Corin Vale," I said. "I have been writing to you since October, and I never signed my name, and in November you asked me for it and I never answered, and that is the first thing I have come to say." The rain went on for a while. She did not gasp, and she did not put her hand over her mouth. What she did was take 1 step back and look at me, really look, the way you look at a piece of work somebody has brought you to mend, and I watched 6 months rearrange themselves behind her eyes, every letter, every unguarded thing either of us had put on paper, all of it landing on a different person than the one she had been writing to. "I never got an answer," she said slowly, "because there wasn't one." "There was. You never got it because I never sent it. That is mine, and I'm not putting it anywhere else." I made myself say the rest of it. "And there is a second thing which is worse. There is to be a betrothal assembly at Hikero at the full moon. My court believes I have spent 6 months courting the Lady Ilsabet Marrow by letter. I have never had a line from her in my life. I knew what they believed by the 2nd week of February, and I let it stand, because I could not think how to say out loud what I was actually doing without sounding like a fool. That is the whole of it. There is nothing worse underneath. She turned round, walked 4 paces to the tower wall, and put the rope down on the step very carefully, which I understood later was because her hands had started shaking and she did not want me to see it. "I rang that," she said with her back to me. "Sire, the assembly. It came up the line on a Tuesday and I rang it on. I stood up there and rang out that the king was to be married at the full moon. I know, I have thought about it every hour since." "And the letter," she said, "the first one, the one I ruined, was to a woman I had never met, and I meant every word in it, and it has been the great fortune of my life that it never reached her." She turned round then. She was crying, and she was furious about it, and she wiped her face with the back of her wrist the way you do when your hands are wet anyway. "You want to know what I've been telling myself for 5 months," she said, "that you were a clerk. Some poor lonely clerk in the muniment room at Hikaro with a cold room and no people, and that I was doing something decent, spending my evenings on him. I have been proud of myself." Her voice cracked straight across. "I have been proud of myself, and you were sitting up there in a castle knowing exactly who I was. I did not know your name until 4 days ago." "You knew you were a king," she said. And there was nothing at all to say to that, because she was entirely right, and I stood in the rain in front of her and took it, and it was the first time in 11 years that anybody in my kingdom had told me the truth to my face without softening it first. She got her breath. She looked at the horse, and the rope and the gorge behind me, and she asked, in an ordinary voice that frightened me far more than the shouting had, "Why have you come?" "To break the betrothal," I said. "That is happening whether you ever speak to me again or not. It is a lie, and it has a woman's name in it who never agreed to any of it, and I'll not have it stand another week. And to ask you to come to Hikaro and stand beside me at the assembly, and let me say in front of the Reach exactly what happened and exactly who I have been writing to." "No," she said. I had come 140 miles, and I had not in all of it seriously considered that she would say that. "Married." "No," she said it steadily. "And I'll tell you why, and then you can go back down, because the light goes early in this gorge, and I won't have you on that track in the dark." She pulled the shawl off her head. It had stopped being any use hours ago. "I am a bellkeeper's daughter with a goat and 11 acres. If I walk into your hall on your arm at the full moon, 400 people are going to look at me and know one of 2 things about me. Either I schemed it, read a king's letter that wasn't mine and got my hooks in, or I'm a soft-headed hill girl who got taken in and carried up to Hikaro to be looked at. There's no third thing they'll think, sire. Not if you fetch me." "I'll tell them the truth." "You'll tell them the truth," she agreed, "and they'll hear you being kind to me. That's what a king's truth sounds like from the floor of a hall." She shook her head slowly. "I've had 6 months of being spoken to as if I were worth listening to, and I would rather keep that and go back to my rope than spend the rest of my life as the thing you were generous about." The rain came down. Somewhere below us her father was in the tower with a book he could no longer read, and above us the bell hung in the wet dark, and I understood that I was being refused by the only person who had ever told me the whole truth, for the only reason I could not argue with. "Then it will be broken without you," I said. "You have my word, and nothing comes of it, no summons, no gift, no man riding up this hill with a paper. If you never write to me again, that is the end, and you have no debt in it anywhere." "That's a hard thing to promise." "It is the only clean one left. I got the horse's rein. My hands were not steady either. One question and then I'll go. In October, when you sat with that letter for 2 days, what made you answer it?" She thought about it honestly. She always did. "It said you ate your supper alone at a table built for 30, she said, and that the sound of your own knife had started to bother you, and my father can't see, and he eats his supper in the dark now whether the candle's lit or not." She looked away. "I couldn't do anything about his. I thought I could do something about yours. I went back down through the chestnut wood in the last of the light with my wolf awake in me for the first time in 11 years, and nowhere on earth to take him. I broke the betrothal on the morning I got back, in front of the full council, before I had changed out of the clothes I had ridden in. Sten Voyle did not argue. He listened to the whole of it standing up, the ruined letter, the 7th tower, the 51 messages. The fortnight Godfrey Sarn held a letter that asked the king for his name, and when I had finished, he was quiet a long moment and then said the only thing that could have made me feel worse. "Sire, in February I said in this room that the correspondence with the lady was proceeding. You were sitting where you are sitting now." "I was." "You could have corrected me in 4 words." "I could." He nodded slowly. "Then I'd ask leave to say one more thing and never say it again. I have served you 11 years and I have never known you lie. But a king who lets a room believe a wrong thing because the right thing embarrasses him, sire, that is a thinner wall than you think it is. It is the same wall. It fell down the same way." "I know it," I said. "It is going into the assembly with everything else." They fought me on that for 2 hours. Not on the breaking. Once they understood there was no Marrow letter and never had been, the breaking was inevitable, and half of them went white thinking about what would have happened if a woman had been walked into that hall and discovered it there. What they fought was the saying. Say the alliance was reconsidered, they said. Say the parties found themselves unsuited. Nobody is harmed, nothing is owed, the Reach shrugs and the thing is forgotten by summer. "Somebody is harmed," I said. "A woman in Marrowhold has been spoken of for 6 months as good as married to me, and will be spoken of afterwards as good as thrown over. And a woman in a tower on the far side of the skein spent 5 months writing to a man who could not be bothered to sign his own name, and a fortnight of it wondering if she had been laughed at. If we tidy this, both of them pay for it and none of us do. It will be said plainly." The full moon fell 9 days later. 400 people came into the great hall at Hykero, all the Hold lords. The Marrows in a body, 20 of them, seated near the front with the particular stiffness of a family that has been told nothing except that they should be present. My council along the side wall, and standing together at the back in their good coats because I had summoned them and had not said why, the 7 keepers of the ladder, 6 of them rather. The 7th chair was empty and I had left it empty deliberately, and every keeper in that room knew exactly whose it was, and none of them knew why it was there. I had no coronet on and no cloak. Bryn had asked me about that in the morning and I told him, if I could not say this in a plain coat, I had no business saying it at all. "You were all called here," I said, "to see a betrothal. There is not going to be one. Before anybody leaves this hall I am going to tell you exactly why, and I would ask you to hear the whole of it because a good deal of it is against me." You could hear the fire. I told them, the council's 2 winters of names. The letter I wrote in October to a woman I had never met, and what was in it. I did not quote it, but I said plainly that it was an honest letter and a lonely one, and that I had signed it with my own hand and sent it down the ladder. The storm, the skein going at the 9th hour. 11 messages held on the wrong side of the water, and a keeper who carried the whole basket down a gorge on a rope in the dark, because one of them was a physician's letter for a sick child at Amberhow, and she did not know which. My letter was on top, I said. It came back to me with the name washed off it. And on the back of it, the keeper of the 7th tower, who had no idea in the world who it was for, and who had sat with it 2 days trying to decide what was decent, had written me an answer. I told them I had written back and not signed it. I told them why, and I did not dress the reason up, that I wanted to be spoken to as a man for once, and that I had taken that at her expense without asking her. 6 months, I said, twice a week. 51 letters up the line and 51 down on the king's own relay in front of every keeper on the ladder. I never once wrote the name Marrow on a page. I never once received it. And when this court decided, reasonably, on the evidence in front of it, that the woman I was writing to was the Lady Elizabeth Marrow. I heard it said out loud in my own council chamber in February, and I let it stand, because to correct it, I would have had to admit what I was actually doing, and I was too proud. Somebody near the Marrow benches said something under their breath. I let it go past. That is my part, I said. There is another part, and it is going to be told by the man it belongs to, Master Sarn. Godfrey Sarn came up the length of that hall like a man walking into cold water. He had written it all down as I told him to, 4 pages of it, and he did not read from the paper. He stood in front of 400 people who had known him all his working life, and said that in November a keeper had come to him with a suspicion, and he had told her to mind her rope. That in November a letter had come up out of the 7th tower asking, in plain words, to be given the name of the man she was writing to or else to be let alone. That he had opened it, which he had no right to do. That he had held it a fortnight while the court announced a royal courtship. And that at the end of that fortnight he had burned it, and had told himself it was a kindness, because he had decided that no good could come to a bell-keeper's daughter from an answer. I have run the ladder 11 years, he said, and his voice went at last. The whole of it is one promise. What is put into a tower comes out the other end. I broke it once, and I broke it against the person on the line with the least power to complain of it, and I would ask nobody in this hall to think better of me than that. He set the papers down on the step and stood there. Master Sarn is removed from his office, I said, and he will not be prosecuted, and he will not be exiled, and nobody in this reach will hound him. He rebuilt 4 towers, and he has told the truth in front of everyone he knows. That is a heavier day than most men have. It is finished. Then I turned to the front benches and I said, Lady Elizabeth. She stood up. I want to say something about Elizabeth Marrow, because she has been made into a piece of furniture in every telling of this story I have ever heard since, and she was nothing of the kind. She was 31 years old, tall, entirely composed, and she had ridden 5 days on 4 days' notice to answer a question no woman should have to answer in public. You were asked, I said, in a letter from me 9 days ago whether you had ever written to me. I have not opened your answer. I asked you to give it here. I never wrote to you, she said, her voice carried to the back of the hall without any apparent effort. Not one line, not one word. I have never had a letter from you either until the one your writer put in my hand at Marrow 9 days ago, which is the first thing addressed to me in this entire business that I was permitted to read. She turned deliberately and looked at her own father. 4 of my letters went to Hikaro over the winter. My seneschal wrote every one of them. I did not see them. I was told the matter was proceeding and that I need not trouble myself, and I asked twice and was told the same. She turned back. So, no, and I will say the rest of it since we are all being honest at some expense today. I am not sorry. I did not want to marry a man I had never met, and I have spent 6 months being congratulated on it, and I am obliged to your Majesty for the first straight question anybody has put to me since October. There was a silence in that hall that I would not have traded for a victory. Then the Reach has heard it from her, I said. No betrothal was ever agreed by the Lady Elizabeth Marrow, and none is broken today. Her name comes out of this clean. Anyone who says otherwise in my hearing will answer to me for it. And that should have been the end of it. That was the whole of what I had planned. I had promised her up on that wet hill with the light going that nothing would come of it. No summons, no gift, no man riding up her hill with a paper. I had meant it. I had spent 9 days keeping it, and it had been the hardest keeping of my life, and every letter I did not write sat in me like a stone. But there was an empty chair at the back of my hall with 6 keepers around it, and 400 people who had just heard exactly how much I owed a woman none of them could name, and I found I could not walk off that step without doing one more thing. Master of the household, I said, have the tower above the town rung. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Asa Farron, 19 years in the post, went out of that hall at a speed I would not have credited, And I went out after her, and 400 people came out after me into the frost and the moonlight, because there is not a soul in the Thurn Reach who can hear a bell rung out of order and stay indoors. They lit the tower fire. Down the gorge, one after another, the shoulders of the Reach began to answer it. The second, then the third away at Callow's Edge, small as a spark, then the fourth, going away eastward into the dark toward the Skane and the Chestnut Wood, and a woman with 11 acres and a goat. I took the rope out of Osa's hands, and I rang one stroke. Understand what that says. Every keeper on that hillside understood it before the sound had come back off the far wall. 2 strokes means taken, it arrived whole, it is being carried, be at peace. 1 stroke means spoiled. The paper is ruined, the seal is broken, the thing did not survive the road. Nothing was ever delivered. Nothing is owed. Sire, Osa said, you want me to log that? Log it, I said. 1 stroke out of Hykaro from the king. And Mistress Farron, when they ask you at the 5th tower and the 6th what it was for, you may tell them exactly. It is for the 7th. It says that a message that never arrived asks nothing of the person who received it. She is free of all of it. She owes no answer, and she never did. The single stroke went down the ladder, tower by tower, into the dark. I stood in the yard and listened to it go, and told myself that I had at least got one thing right at the end. It was 7 minutes before the 4th tower rang back up the line. 2 strokes. I did not understand at first. There is no answer to spoiled, it is not a question. Then the 3rd tower repeated it, and the 2nd, and Osa Farron came out onto the stair with her face like a woman watching the sky do something impossible, and the tower above my head rang it back over the town. 2 strokes, twice, the pattern for a message traveling up the ladder and not down. That's not 7, she said. That's 4. Sire, that's coming out of 4, there's someone standing in the 4th tower. 4 is at Amberhow. Amberhow is 2 days hard riding from Hykaro, and 3 from the Skane. She had left the day after I did. They brought her into the yard an hour before dawn, on a borrowed horse, in the same gray shawl, with the mud of 5 days on her and her father's old satchel across her chest, and 400 people who had refused to go home parted in front of her without being asked to, which I have never in my life seen them do for me. She got down. She looked at the crowd and the torches and the great doorway of Hykaro, and I watched her decide not to be frightened of any of it, and then she came across the yard to me and stopped a good arm's length away in front of everybody and opened the satchel. These are yours, she said, and put 51 letters into my hands. I could not say anything at all. I'm not giving them back to be rid of them, she said, loudly enough to carry, because she had thought about this on the road and she was not going to be mistaken for anything. I'm giving them back because they were sent to a keeper by a man with no name on him, and you told a hall full of people tonight what you did, so now they can go in a proper book with a proper hand on them. That's how the ladder works. A thing gets logged where it came from. Then her chin came up and she said, and I wanted in the log where I came from as well. I came on my own horse. Nobody fetched me. Nobody sent for me. There wasn't a paper. There wasn't, I said. I gave you my word there wouldn't be, and I kept it, and I have never been sorrier about keeping anything. I know you kept it, she said. That's why I came. The whole yard heard that. I did not care. You said you'd not walk into my hall on my arm, I said. I've walked into your yard on my own feet, she said. That's a different sentence. I had had 9 days to think of what I would say if this impossible thing happened, and I had prepared a great deal of it, and every word went out of my head. What I said instead was, "You rang 2 strokes." I did. You had no right. That message was rung to release you. I know what it was rung for. Everybody on the line knew what it was rung for. The 5th had it before I did and shouted it up. She was shaking. It was cold and she had ridden 5 days and she was shaking for none of those reasons. You rang spoiled, sire. You rang it out over the whole reach so 400 people would know I was let off. and it was a decent thing, and it was the wrong ring, and I have been carrying other people's letters for 6 years, and I am not having it in the book that way. She put her hand out flat, the way you do when you want a rope put in it. 2 strokes. It arrived whole. It's being carried. Be at peace. That's the true one. I'd have wrung it in October if I'd known who to ring it to. I took her hand. That is all. There was no shifting and no white light, and nothing in that yard that a stranger passing on the road would have called magic. But my wolf, silent 11 years, awake since a wet wood on the far side of the skein, settled in me the way a dog settles in front of a fire, all at once, with a sound in my chest like a door being let go instead of shut. And she made a small noise and looked down at our 2 hands, and I looked down, and across both our palms there was a faint gray line, running edge to edge, exactly the color of ink that has been rained on. The mark of my house is a wolf's head. It has been for 400 years. Mine came up as a line of a spoiled letter, and hers came up the same, and it has never once faded on either of us. Her father came down to Hikaro at midsummer with his sight nearly gone and would not stay, and told me at the gate, with great seriousness, that his daughter had been a difficult child and that I should not expect to win an argument with her, which is the only true prophecy I have ever received. The goat came too. It is still alive. It has bitten 3 of my council. She would not be married in the great hall. We were married in the yard of the 7th tower in October with 60 people, most of them from Brackenwind, and the chestnuts came down on the roof through the whole of it like somebody dealing cards very slowly on the other side of the wall. Godfrey Sarn farms above Callow's Edge and sends up a written report on the state of the 4th tower's rope every spring, unasked, in a hand I know as well as my own by now. I read every one of them. I have never once sent for him, and he has never once come, and I think that arrangement suits us both. And there is a rule in the latter now that was not there before. Every message that goes into a tower goes into the book with the keeper's own name against it, not the tower's number, not the hold, the name, so that no message on my relay ever again arrives from nobody. Merad wrote it. I signed it. Asa Farron, who is master of the latter now and finds my steward whenever she can, keeps the book herself. I have thought a great deal about the old belief, the one my counsel would have laughed at in daylight, that a message sent toward a false match will not hold, that the seal breaks and the rider falls and the rain gets in. I do not know whether it is true. I am a practical man, and I suspect the truth is only that it was raining very hard in October, and her coat was not as good as she thought. But I know that the letter I meant for a stranger came apart at the top and survived everywhere else, and that of the 400 people in my hall that night, not one had done anything for me that cost them a broken bridge and a rope in the dark. She still eats her supper too fast. 6 years in a tower will do that. We do not use the long table. It is in the hall for feasts, and it has 30 places, and I have not sat at it alone since, and I could not tell you now what my own knife sounded like on that plate, which was the sentence that started all of this, and is the only line of that letter I have been glad to lose.